On today's episode of Notable New England, I'm speaking with author Ken Lizotte about his new book, Walden For Hire, Business Lessons from Henry David Thoreau. Would you ever have thought of Thoreau as an accomplished entrepreneur? We most often hear about him being known for being a part of the transcendentalism movement, his writing, and environmentalism. Ken tells us about the hidden business lessons we can learn from Thoreau. It's an interesting conversation that I'm sure you're going to learn a lot from. Stay tuned. Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome back to Notable New England. I'm your host, Gretchen B., a lifelong, proud New Englander. For those who may be tuning in for the first time, welcome. I'm so grateful to have you here. Now, before we begin, I want to send a special shout out to my newest Patreon supporter, Isaac. Many thanks, Isaac, for joining the Pumpkin Spice Latte tier and for your generosity in helping to keep the lights on and the podcast going. If you want to be like Isaac and become a monthly sustaining member of the podcast, you can find out all about that at patreon.com/Notable New England. Plans start as low as $2 a month, which is less than a cup of coffee at your favorite cafe. You get early ad-free listening, and depending on which tier you choose, even more wonderful benefits like Notable New England merch and more. So feel free to visit patreon.com/Notable New England today and check out all I have to offer. And you can become a part of keeping this podcast on the airwaves, just like our dear friend Isaac. Thank you again, Isaac. I'm very excited to have author Ken Lizotte, who is a resident of Concord, Massachusetts, and the President Emeritus of the Board of Trustees for the Henry David Thoreau Farm. He wrote a new book that's just come out titled Walden For Hire, Business Lessons from Henry David Thoreau that I think you're going to find really fascinating. I sure did. We all know Thoreau, of course, for his writing, most notably his book Walden, and his commitment to the environment. But did you know that he was also a very accomplished entrepreneur? So Ken is going to shed some light into Thoreau's business mindset and the lessons we today can learn from him and apply. But before we get to the discussion with Ken, let's dig into some Wicked Light Bites, community-oriented stories and happenings from each New England state. Did you know that there is a Valentine Phantom in Montpelier, Vermont, who puts up red hearts all over the city? Yes, since 2002, a mysterious person or persons decorate the city in red hearts on Valentine's Day. And as Elena Gustafson, the owner of Montpelier's Magpie and Tiger, a local stationery and gift store, says, quote, "No matter what the weather is, every morning on Valentine's Day, you walk through the town and there are red hearts. It is one of the loveliest sights to wake up to in the morning," end quote. Apparently, the Phantom has a team of decorators. Local art teacher Krista Kane says that she received an email from the Phantom years ago asking kids to make artwork on printed hearts that would be hung up all around the city for Valentine's Day. To this day, she does not know who the Phantom or the Phantom's helpers are, and she likes that this is shrouded in mystery. She says, quote, I put all the hundreds of hearts that the kids make into a box and I bring them to the front office, and then one of the Phantom's helpers comes to pick it up. So I don't even know who their helpers are, end quote. Vermont Edition on Vermont Public says they received an email from the Phantom stating that the mission of the hearts reflect, quote, what Montpelier already knows. We are far from perfect, but we choose to build community through small intentional acts of love, kindness, and respect. Any community of humans can choose this, end quote. Information for this item comes from Michaela Lafrock and Andrea Lorian at Vermont Public. Love sure can stink, but the Rhode Island SPCA helped the heartbroken in a unique way for Valentine's Day. They designed a fundraiser where for a $10 donation, you could give them the name of someone who did you dirty, and it gets written on a paper heart and then buried in a box of kitty litter where the cats, do their business. Stephanie Van Patten, the RISPCA's Director of Community Engagement, says, quote, we use our cats to provide retribution for any ex-lover or thing that you don't like and want to get back at. End quote, she explained. Yep, that's retribution spelled with a P-U. The RISPCA provided photos on Facebook and Instagram of the proof of the retribution. Chloe Pothier, the social media manager for the RISPCA, says, quote, sometimes Valentine's Day is not always the happiest time of year for some people, so hopefully this brings them some joy, end quote. This was the third year the RISPCA did this fundraiser. Information for this item comes from David Wright at Ocean State Media. Will the apple cider donut become the official donut for the state of New Hampshire? A group of fourth graders in Nashua hope so. The fourth graders from Nashua's Bicentennial Elementary School drafted a bill to recognize the apple cider donut as the official state donut for New Hampshire after a visit to the State House and where they learned that the pumpkin was named the state fruit in 2006 from fourth graders in Harrisville. Representative Laura Talerski, who represents Nashua, said, quote, the students from Bicentennial went back to their classroom, did the research, worked as a team, and built a thoughtful case for the apple cider donut to be named the state donut, end quote. If the bill is passed, New Hampshire would join two other states, Massachusetts and Louisiana, with an official state donut. As one student said, quote, let's make people think of New Hampshire every time they eat an apple cider donut. End quote. Information for this item comes from Amelia Wisniewski of the Concord Monitor. Students from the University of Bridgeport Phones School of Dental Hygiene are bringing a mobile dental hygiene clinic to people in need of dental hygiene services in Connecticut. Adriana Fields, program director at the school, says, quote, it's access to care in the sense of bringing care to the patient where they are, where they're comfortable, end quote. The students visit schools across the area and provide free care, and twice a week they set up at the Oakview School in Trumbull, Connecticut, which is a special education school for young adults. Crystal Quaynor, an adjunct clinical professor at the school, says, quote, there are many barriers to care in general, in life for everyone. So when it comes to special needs or special care dentistry, that those barriers become a little bit more. Some students were able to do all of that in the first appointment. Some students were on appointment number 3 and were just now getting into the mouth. But that's fine because they're leaving happy And every appointment, we're able to get farther and farther in treatment. The goal is to make them comfortable so that even if they do seek care outside of here and they do go to an office or hospital, they feel more comfortable because they've experienced what it's like here. End quote. Information for this item comes from Julia LeBlanc at NBC Connecticut. Help is coming to Maine blueberry farmers who experienced a challenging 2025 growing season. The Wild Blueberry Commission has announced a $1.3 million grant for eligible producers. The Wild Blueberry Commission of Maine estimates that $28 million was lost in 2025 in the blueberry industry due to heavy spring rains and then extreme heat and drought during the growing season. That, along with the increase in per-acre production costs, have put many farmers in a difficult financial situation. The $1.3 million emergency grant will be distributed to eligible wild blueberry producers. Applications for the grant will be online. You can visit the Wild Blueberry Commission of Maine via their website with any questions, and their website is wildblueberrycommissionofmaine.org. Information for this item comes from the staff at WGME 13. Kendall Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts has a new food hall. Eastern Edge Food Hall opened February 13th. The 11,000 square foot food hall is located underneath MIT graduate student housing and is called Eastern Edge because it sits on the eastern edge of the MIT campus. There are 9 vendors serving food and drink, and they are Clover, the local healthier fast food chain that started as a food truck on MIT's campus, Juicy J's, which will be serving cheeseburgers with house-made sauces and freshly baked rolls, Perilla's Korean Kitchen serving Korean bibimbap bowls, Everybody's Gotta Eat, serving Southern and Caribbean comfort food, Viet Citron, which makes scratch-made Vietnamese street food, Lone Star Taco Stand, which makes some of the area's best tacos, Bacaro Cafe and Bar serves coffee and pastries by day and wine with Venetian snacks and small plates at night. Fuji Sushi is offering ready-to-go sushi and sashimi, and Chatty Patty, offering fresh out-of-the-oven Caribbean patties. Eastern Edge can seat 275 people and can be used for educational purposes, community activities, and private events. To visit, the address is 290 Main Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Information for this item comes from Caitlin Umholtz at boston.com. Up after the break, I'll be joined by author Ken Lizotte to discuss his new book, Walden For Hire, Business Lessons from Henry David Thoreau. Stick around. You are listening to Notable New England. Notable New England is a true one-person podcast. I research, write, record, edit, and produce every episode myself because I care deeply about sharing the stories, people, and places that make our region so special. The goal has always been simple: spread community love and inspire all of us to be active in our New England communities. If the show has meant something to you, there are a few easy ways to help keep it going. You can become a monthly sustaining member at patreon.com/Notable New England. Memberships start at just $2 a month, and you'll get early ad-free listening, plus, depending on your tier, Notable New England merch and other special gifts. Even a small monthly contribution goes a long way toward covering the real costs of making the podcast. So you can go to patreon.com/Notable New England to become a sustaining member today. If you prefer to make a one-time gift, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/notable New England. Perfect if you'd rather support the show once in a while. Again, that's buymeacoffee.com/notable New England. You can leave a 5-star review. Reviews help more people discover the podcast and make a huge difference in visibility. And you can help spread the word by telling a friend, sharing an episode, posting about it on social media. Word of mouth is one of the biggest ways this community grows. The podcast exists because of listeners like you. Thank you for being a part of this New England community and for helping keep this little one-person show going. Today I'm joined by Ken Lizotte, founder and CEO of Emerson Consulting Group Incorporated and President Emeritus of the Board of Trustees at Thoreau Farm. He is the author of 8 previous books and has been a regular columnist for the Huffington Post, Money Inc., and the American Management Association, as well as Boston Magazine. He is also a resident of Concord, Massachusetts, and not far from Walden Pond, in fact. Welcome to the podcast today, Ken. It's great to have you here to discuss your new book, Walden For Hire, Business Lessons from Henry David Thoreau.
Thanks, Gretchen. I'm happy to be here. And I'm not that far from you either, from what you told me before we started.
Indeed.
I'm in Concord. And for people who don't know, that's only about 20 miles away. So we could have met in the middle and tried to do this that way.
Very true. Very true. I'm so grateful that you're joining me today to discuss the new book. First and foremost, I'd love for you to tell the listeners what inspired you to write Walden For Hire and to explore Thoreau as an entrepreneur rather than a philosopher and writer, which is sort of what he's more known as.
Sure. Well, this is one of those ideas that came together like bang all of a sudden, years longer than one would think. And the reason is that my day job is that I have a business where I help business experts get published and be seen as thought leaders. And that means when they get published means I've probably gotten a couple of, I don't know, I'm losing track, but a few hundred business experts over the years I've been doing this, find a publisher or self-publish their book or whatever. So books is part of it, what happens every day I'm thinking, but I'm always thinking in terms of business books, not novels or memoirs, but business books. And I got involved pro bono with Thoreau Farm, the birthplace of Henry, and anybody who wants to really get some Henry vibes could come there and see the room that he was born in. But I was on the board for over 10 years, and I was president for about 10 years as well. I came into contact with so much about Henry and who he was and what he did. And it just hit me one day that although you can find talk about Henry's work habits or attitudes or even business thoughts, but in various books about Henry, that's never the theme of a book. And people who know Henry really well, just been fans for years or whatever. The first time, for example, that I mentioned this idea to 2 people who were very involved with the Thoreau culture, let's say, subculture, they kind of chuckled. They couldn't help themselves. They kind of chuckled. What, Henry, business? What? That makes no sense. But it did make sense to me, although I couldn't prove it. So I started to do a little research, and the more I did, the more I wanted to do, and the more I found this and that. And at some point I said, this is a book. This is definitely a book. And far as I can tell, it's never been done before. A book about Henry as a business genius. I will say it that way.
And when I was reading the book, Thoreau struck me as an early example of today's modern gig economy worker. I mean, he had multiple jobs, multiple disciplines. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on what freelancers, creatives, and independent workers can learn from him.
Well, yeah, it's really true that he had a number of jobs, and more than just jobs, they were real careers that he built very successfully over and over. But they tended not to overlap, although they did in certain ways. But as someone whose primary career was to become a writer, which is Henry, I'm talking about Henry now, not myself. It was clear that to be a published writer and a successful writer, anybody who writes knows that you've got to write again and revise and look and this and that, look at it again. And so you're really putting yourself, your attention, your meticulousness for producing the best thing that you can. That's really what writers do. So that was what he brought to other things as he started to feel like as he said, after 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days at Walden, he felt it was to leave. And some of his people who knew him in Concord said, "Well, why would you leave after being there that long?" And he said, "Well, I realized that I have other lives to live. And this one I have to let go and move on." So we did move on to other things, such as working in his father's pencil factory and becoming a surveyor and all this. But he brought that same meticulous commitment that he had as a writer, that he continued to have as a writer. And I think that if you want to call it like gig freelancers, those what the lesson is, we should always pay attention to what we're doing and commit ourselves completely. And then if you start to get burned out or you just want to change in pace or whatever, yeah, go to the next gig. But always put yourself front and center for what it is that you do. Don't take it as just a job I'm going to have for a couple of years or something like that.
You mentioned in the book that if Thoreau were to have a LinkedIn profile today, that it would be pretty impressive. And who wouldn't want to hire him based on the things that he accomplished business wise? Why do you think that Thoreau's entrepreneurial side has largely been overlooked?
Yeah, that part of the book that you're referring to, I put a mock LinkedIn resume in there. It's hard for me to answer this question because, in a way, I don't know. Like I said, that a lot of the research that I did reading other books about him, essays, and whatever I could find. And when I say whatever I can find, you could find a lot, and I could still be researching it now years later, but there were pieces of it that were there. But for some reason, I think it's just that Henry's reputation, if you will, is as a writer, as an environmentalist, as and even as I won't say, well, I don't want to say a loafer because that's not what he was, but there are people who think of him that way. Is that he didn't do much. He walked around Walden Woods and he lived alone in a cabin along the shores of Walden Pond, and he didn't actually do that much. But that's not true. And so all I can do is go back to what I said before. I had a special situation in terms of the consulting business that I have with business books, business articles, business, and then having to do this volunteer work at the place where Henry was born. I don't know. It was a unique conflagration of what could be, and just for some reasons, it slipped through people's fingers or minds or whatever.
I think you make a great point about the misconception that Henry David Thoreau was, for lack of a better word, a loafer. He really wasn't. And what's striking is how wide ranging his work was. And honestly, it's not that different from how many people are living now. I mean, gone are the days of staying with one company for 40 years and then retiring. A lot of us hold down day jobs for the steady income and benefits while also pursuing other ways to make money, sometimes to make ends meet, sometimes because we just hope those passions will eventually become a full time gig. Reading your book, I found myself thinking about Thoreau in a similar way. I mean, he imagined himself as a poet when he first started out. He wanted to be a poet. And while he worked at that, he had multiple other pursuits. And he did have the privilege of using the land for his cabin for no cost, which is pretty much unheard of today. But he did also supplement his income with various jobs, and he lived simply, cut down on spending, and wasn't really driven by material things, which is kind of in stark contrast to the consumeristic world we live in today, where things like homes and cars and status symbols define success. Anyone who's read Walden would know Henry was not about that sort of lifestyle. I'm curious what lessons you think we can take from his approach.
That's really so much of a theme in his life, even though he was living back in the time of the beginning of the industrial age and, very different than the way things are now that are just so built up and so much. If you get a job, it will pay you some money and you shouldn't just loaf around or whatever. I always was fascinated too by the fact that so he's living at the cabin in Walden Pond, but he's at the back of his mind, there was always this idea of surveying as something that could be of interest to him. And I think it was the second year that he was there, right in January or February, where the ice was completely frozen over. He decided that he'd leave his cabin and walk down to the pond and start to survey Walden Pond. He wasn't getting paid for that. It's kind of like auditioning for a job that doesn't even exist exactly. But it was a passion of his. So he kept moving with that particular one in particular. He'd spent so much time trying to find the bottom of Walden Pond as well as he could. Some people thought there was no bottom. It was like just go through the earth or something. But he was able to figure that out. But he was not being paid for it or anything. And in the end, that led to a small surveying job in Concord, and then another small one, this and that. And he brought that same focus that carried him through all these various lives and gigs. And eventually he became the premier, the chief surveyor of Concord. He was considered the best. So that's what I think we have to always contend with, is the understanding that the job that we have, we need to put ourselves into it and not assume that we should be thinking about something else somewhere.
What do you think helped Thoreau navigate these various job changes throughout his life?
I spent some time before I'd mentioned my business as one helping business experts who actually become thought leaders and focusing on the things that they care about. Prior to that, I had run another business that was a career-oriented business. What we were doing, my partner and I were doing, was helping professionals who were our clients identify what they wanted to do in their lives next. The key question that they had to answer, which we had various ways of trying to help them creatively get this answer out from inside them, was, what do you want? What do you want to do? What do you want? What do you want for your personal life? What are the things? And it's very hard for a lot of people to do that, to answer that question or to ask themselves that question. But it's a simple but powerful question. And it really helps people. I did that for 10 years. And it's amazing with some of my clients. One became a doctor. Another was a lawyer who actually moved to Vermont with his wife and became a weaver, believe it or not. And it was like, what do you want? What do you want in your life? And I think Henry was really good at that. He didn't have my program or any book to read. He was sort of adamant about how his life was going to be. So again, I go back to that other quote that I mentioned before. I feel like I have some other lives to live. I feel like I have some other lives to live. He wasn't even sure what they were, but he felt that it was time to go. And in that case, one of them became the surveying, and it also became his reinvention of the pencil, which is like, when I first heard about that, I didn't know about that throughout most of my life. But when somebody told me about that situation, that he invented the pencil, or reinvented is probably more like it, and it's the pencil that most of us use today, I thought, this one thing, if this was the only thing he did in his whole life, This one thing he would have made history. But for him, it was just one of those lives. He focused on that, and he was able to create, again, I should say, recreate the pencil as it's now known today. So he had, I don't know where he got it, but he had this ability to focus on what he wanted, not what other people thought he should do.
Yes, in your book, you highlight that Thoreau was really focused on what we might now call work life balance. And he didn't want to spend 6 days a week toiling away and having no personal time, which back in his time was very common. This was before labor laws, paid time off, and all of that. Today, it almost feels like we've slid back into that world with hustle culture because we're always having to be on and always working thanks to the technology that we have. Thoreau seemed to want a life where he could work, but also engage with his community and pursue his interests and have space to write and think and explore. And, that seems like a luxury today for many. And frankly, it's a privilege for many when jobs demand everything from us around the clock.
Well, another one of his quotations is, it's important to be industrious, but what are you industrious about? So were you industrious? Are you industrious about because there was a big factory that was put into Concord right around that time called the Damon Mill. And it was clothing of some kind. It was textiles and that kind of thing. Back in those days, people had to work 6 days a week, all day. He couldn't imagine that. Henry would spend literally 4 hours a day roaming around or sauntering, as Thoreauvians like to call it, Walden Woods and other areas in Concord. One time he was having a conversation with someone about traveling. This person said, well, I've traveled here and there. I've gone to Paris, this and that. And Henry said, well, I've done a lot of traveling myself right here in Concord. So, yeah, the question is, what are you being industrious about? And again, go back to Henry and what I said about him being able to focus on what would he get passionate about. The reinvention of the pencil was not something he was really thinking about as led up to it, but there he was in his father's pencil shop. He was helping his father at that time with the normal business of being a successful pencil maker, but pencils were all kind of weird and sometimes they'd be sloppy and this and that. But he said, there's something wrong here and I want to find out what it is. So he went and researched it, and I'll tell you, he did.
Talking about how he used to roam around town, it makes me think of it as being like today's version of networking. He was out talking to people, was not just for nothing. It served him tremendously in his personal and professional life. And I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Yeah, sure. That's something that probably some people who think he was just like a mid 19th century hippie or something, that he was just kind of, again, loafing around or whatever. But he was trying to pick up knowledge and learn things. And he enlisted a couple of people that he met who were also living like in a shanty at Walden Pond to come and help him with certain aspects of his cabin when he was put in it. There's a myth is that he did the whole thing himself, but you couldn't raise a roof, for example, even a small building like that. So he needed help, and he would get people to come and help him, and then he would help them. So that's the essence of networking, to if it's really going to work, that it's a give and take. And so the roaming around that he did, yeah, everybody knew him. I mean, it's a small village at the time, but everybody knew him. And for the most part, they felt that he was an interesting guy, a good fellow, and somebody you could rely on. I'm being a little tentative, though, with that because there was also an incident, which I didn't get into in the book because it wasn't especially relevant to my theme. But there was an incident where he caused a forest fire, just because he was camping with someone else in the nearby woods close to Walden. I forget exactly the details, but somehow he wasn't tending the fire correctly, and a spark jumped over to some dry brush and then some more. Before he knew it, the fire got out of control. They didn't have big fire engines like we have now, but they did have like volunteer fire. Everybody was a volunteer fireman or person. And so the fire was put out, but it took a while. And it really burned down a lot of area. And there were a lot of people that never forgave him for that. They would even kind of emit a slur as he might walk by, something like, fire maker or something just horrible like that, fire maker. that's that's as bad as it got to be. That's the four-letter word, was fire. But anyway, so there was a little of it he had to kind of live down. There's a theory that happened before he moved into the cabin or put the cabin up and lived there, but that was a motivation for him to go there, to do that he could get really at one with the environment. And there was a sort of a spiritual atonement that he was trying to achieve at that time. But it's, we all make mistakes. That was a big one, really, but we all make mistakes. And it happens when we're networking today. But I think that the networking metaphor is pretty apt. That's what he was doing.
You point out that Thoreau valued intentionality over efficiency, and you can see that in everything he did. Even his move to Walden Woods after the unfortunate fire episode, it came from his desire to really understand nature and live on purpose. He wasn't just trying to be productive. He was trying to be present and deliberate in how he lived and worked. And that feels like such a contrast to today's hustle culture, where we're expected to multitask constantly and be as efficient as possible and be everything to anyone. And, a jack of all trades, master of none. Henry, though, seemed to be a jack of all trades, master of all that he took on, almost like he was aiming for that mastery through focus and intention rather than speed and efficiency. What lessons do you think that we can take from his approach?
Once again, he really would pay attention to it. He'd really focus on it. He'd put himself into it. And when it was time to move on to another life, as he put it, then he would do that. He wouldn't just like another famous quotation: "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." He could see that. He could not abide the idea of doing that. And he also could not abide the idea of taking a job that he felt he was morally compromised. So we go to one of his early jobs, which was being a teacher in Concord. That in itself was an achievement, because it was a depression nationwide. And back then they didn't call them depressions or recessions. They called them panics. Panic of 1837. And he had just graduated from Harvard, but the job market was bleak. Somehow somebody knew him and knew the kind of guy he was, and they ended up hiring him to teach elementary school age pupils in Concord. But he only lasted either a week or 10 days because he was being asked to do something that he didn't believe in, and that was corporal punishment for discipline. Now, talk about multitasking and all. This was kind of a way to regiment students in those days, which I think in some ways we still have to deal with today. But it was about efficiency. You don't want kids to get too crazy and too this and too that. So just slap them on the wrists, the knuckles or whatever, and make them stop. Well, he couldn't abide by that. And so he ended up, the day that he was told by a supervisor that he needed to do that, he reluctantly did it. And then he decided that same day, he went to this guy's office and said, "I quit." Okay, so he quits. He's left a job that was very envious because of the situation. And then, I'm not sure exactly when, maybe a year or two later, maybe a little more, but he and his brother started school in Concord. And it was the same school age, but they owned the school. This is where he becomes an entrepreneur. It's the same reason for existence, which is to help kids learn and to teach them whatever is the curriculum. But no way would they allow themselves to do corporal punishment in order to maintain discipline. Instead, they let kids have more freedom. Remember, I said before how we used to go out for 4-hour saunters around Concord. Well, he did that as part of the curriculum. So he would lead, maybe they have to walk from the school about a mile down to where Walden Pond is. And he would bring them there and just ask them, what do you see? What can you learn about being here? And just a kind of an easy, not a bang, 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 learn this, learn that. Just what are you learning by just taking it slower and opening your eyes? So these are the kinds of things that we can learn from even today. A lot of people will never learn from them or believe what you and I are talking about in terms of that, but that's how he felt about it. If there are business or even life lessons from him, that's the sort of counterintuitive or counter-conventional action, activity, behavior, etc., that he brought out in his life and transferred it to, in this case, students, young kids, but in most cases, all the people that he met and interacted with in Concord.
It really feels like a testament to Thoreau living his values. I mean, he goes to Walden Woods because he wants to live intentionally, to be in nature, learn from the land, and shape his life around what matters to him. And then he takes that teaching job. He's put in this awful position where he's expected to use corporal punishment, which he does not believe in. And he can't reconcile that with his values. So he ends up leaving. He starts his own school. And in that school, instead of having kids memorize and be obedient, he takes them outside. He wants them to observe and to talk about what they see and think for themselves. He was, more interested in developing critical thinkers than in producing students who could just recite facts and avoid punishment. And that really speaks to his whole value system, living and working with intention, even when it's less efficient or less conventional.
Absolutely, yeah. Free thinker, critical thinker, artistic, aesthetic thinkers, just paying attention to and being a part of the world around everyone. That was what was driving the movement called Transcendentalism, which Henry was a part of, and Ralph Waldo Emerson was a big part of, and a number of others that tended to be mainly writers around Concord in those days. They just believed that to be spiritual, we just need to engage with nature. That nature is spiritual on its own, and we're a part of that. So it wasn't so much going to church services and that sort of thing, but allowing yourself to be at one with the universe around you. And yeah, Henry took this kind of thing to heart and incorporated it in such a way that he was, as I said, he was even helping students appreciate that and hopefully grow up and appreciate it their whole lives.
I'd love to ask you, what aspects of modern business culture do you think that Thoreau would critique? I think I know what you're going to say, but I would love to ask you about that. And also, what would he agree with that's happening today?
Yeah. What do you think I'm going to say?
I'd say being able to step away from the hustle culture and get back to being focused and intentional instead of focusing solely on efficiency and constant multitasking. You know, the whole jack of all trades, master of none trap that a lot of us kind of fall into. I think also, to try to find some version of work-life balance, taking time away from your work and your phone and being on all the time and making space to engage with your community and spending time in nature and participating in things you actually believe in, things that reflect your values, in building a life that feels more intentional than just busy.
Right. Yeah. Okay, good. So that's part A of what I would have said. That's very good. Part B is part B. I think about this question in terms of the fact that at that period of time, technology was coming in a way that it does now. Although for us, we're living in such an explosion of technology. It was a little more simplified back in Henry's day, but it was technology nonetheless. And he had his doubts about that. For example, the train. When he first moved into Walden Pond and set up his cabin, I don't think the train was there yet, but it was there within the first year or so. And the train goes right by it. It doesn't go over Walden Pond or anything, but it goes close enough so that you're going to hear it, you're going to see it. Well, Henry didn't like that. And so people think he was anti-technology, and in a way he was, but he would look at the train, he'd see in the window people who were from Concord or for other villages nearby, and they were being taken into Boston to work at factories in Boston. And he would look at it and he'd say, well, why do they need to go all the way to Boston to work? Why can't they work here and this and that? He just didn't get this idea that the train was useful in too many other ways. Until as time went by, though, and he was actually a very curious person when it came to things like technology. If he was in, let's say, Boston and walking by some kind of a factory and wasn't sure what they made, he would literally go inside and ask them if he could take a tour and could he, understand better what they were doing. So he was always interested in that kind of thing. In terms of the train, he tried it one day going into Boston to see what it was like. And he did. Of course, he went to Harvard, your town, Cambridge. So he had some experience with walking around and roaming and sauntering around Boston and Cambridge, because for people who don't know it, Boston and Cambridge are more or less one city in a sense. And so he took this train trip and he went into Boston and he started walking around like you love to do. And he went to, there might have been a museum that he could go into or an Athenaeum. There was and still is a Boston Athenaeum. And then could come back to Concord the same day. And that impressed him. And he started to see the value of the train. Not that he changed his mind about what I said before about people working in Boston and why do they have to go there, but he could see a value that a train could offer him. And if that were so, it could be other people being offered other things. So he was like that. Now, flash forward to today. Oh, what do we hear about today all the time? AI, 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 AI. Sounds like AI, AI, EIO. I think that the difference in our world and having AI as an example, just kind of, 25 years ago was the internet bubble. And now it's AI. It's so much. It's so heavy. Henry would just see a train go by and then nothing would happen for an hour or two. And then he'd see another train go by. It's sort of simplified. So he could handle it. But I think that that's the problem with our lives today is how do we snuff out the noise and the overload of information in a way that, and be able to look at it the way Henry did, where he could experience it or he could let it churn over in his mind, that sort of thing.
That's a great point. Curiosity. I think we could all stand to be a little more curious the way that Thoreau was. I mean, if we go back to the story of the pencil when he was thinking, like, okay, there's got to be a better way to make this so it's not all smudging everywhere, we wouldn't have the number two pencil as we know it. That kind of curiosity, wanting to understand how something works and how it might be improved, feels like an important lesson for us now. And I think the same applies today, especially with things like AI. I don't think it's healthy to completely shut down and say, like, nope, I'm not even going to learn about it. You can hold some skepticism, of course, but it doesn't have to totally close you off. And I think back to what you said about Thoreau being skeptical of the train, but he was still curious enough to study it and to think about it. And then he used it in ways that worked for him. So, like having that balance between being curious but thoughtful, but also being discerning seems like a good model for how we should navigate new tools and technologies now.
Yeah, that was one of the insights into Henry that I never understood until I learned that he, as I said before, that he did used to like go just literally walk into a factory and just brazenly say, "Gee, I'd love to know more about this," and get a tour and that kind of a thing. Most of us don't do that, so we don't really exercise our curiosity. Maybe we don't even allow ourselves to be curious, possibly because there is so much that we're overloaded with today.
Now, how did Thoreau define success? And how does that differ from today's definitions of success, do you think?
We do think of success, at least I do, that success today is all about monetary success, financial success, and all. That's just so important. We didn't have billionaires back in Henry's day, and now it's like so many billionaires. I think for him, I think that to some extent, there still was this material success because that's what he was referring to. And he said the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. He talks a lot about people having a lot of bills for costs involved with like owning a house. Even like today it was the same thing, but he never let himself get into that. And he talks in the first chapter of Walden, and I put it near the front of the book too, what he called the necessaries of life, the necessaries. He felt that the more you could let go of things, then the more free you would be. Food was a necessary, shelter was a necessary, warmth was a necessary, clothing and a good fireplace and that kind of thing. Warmth was important. There's a fourth one, and I'm forgetting at the moment what it was, but
I think I recall you saying in the book community, sense of community was an important thing.
right. Yeah. So that gets us back to the fact that he really did interact with a lot of people. He was not a recluse in the sense that people think of it. But I think that for him, and I don't think it's really different today, although there's a lot of pressures on us to have a lot of things and to have to pay for those things and to have to work harder in order to make enough money for those things. He just did not want to put himself in that space. And the more that you can pay attention to what he meant by the necessaries of life, there was not like lots of garish things and extras that were just for show or anything like that, then the more you get to his frame of mind when it comes to what success was. Success should really be about what's inside you, your core, what are your values, what do you enjoy. When he was surveying, one reason why he loved surveying was that although his job was to help like these landowners and farmers make money by knowing exactly what land they owned and being able to, for example, cut down trees on their land that Henry might have said, "Oh gosh, no, those are beautiful trees. You're cutting them down." They cut them down for wood, and then they'd sell the wood and all that. That was an ethical issue for him that he did his best to get over. But the other thing was that he loved being outdoors. So it was a job that allowed him to be outdoors most of the time. So what can you do? That was success to him. And what can we all do to create success, similar successes in our lives? What do we care about?
How did researching this book change how you approach your own work and define success?
I think for me, I think I've always tried to live according to certain values that he espouses. You can't get too much of trying to live your life in a way that isn't succumbing to these material aspects. And also, what is it that you really care about? I mean, I've written a few other books in the past, and that's been fine. But this was a different book for me because this was not in the past. My other books have been like related to my business, for example, directly. Like, for example, I have a book called The Expert's Edge, which is about what I was saying before that I do with business experts and help them get their books written and published. And so I have a chapter on that. Okay, so that's directly related to that business. But this was sort of a fun, intriguing thought. Henry as a businessman, as a business person. And I think that the extent to which I felt good about that, Henry reinforced it. And I see that as whatever might be my next book. I would like it to be, I'm not going to guarantee it, but I would like it to be something like that, where it just felt like, as a book, it was a real interesting concept. And I wanted to just enjoy the delving into the research about it and then making some sense out of it and like that. So the book itself on its own is, Henry gave me that permission to let this project be whatever it became.
What is one idea from the book that you hope readers and listeners apply to their own lives?
Pay attention to what you want. Pay attention definitely comes from Henry, because pay attention again is like I think I've got I got a piece in the book that's a lot of people know, where he came across some armies, literally armies of ants. And he got down on the ground and he looked. He didn't know they were armies until he got down there and he saw they were fighting with each other, these groups. And he spent time just lying there and just looking at it, paying attention. And paying attention was definitely his life. But again, I'll go back to my own work with professionals years ago, when we would be guiding, without knowing much about Henry at all, we were guiding professionals toward that question of what did they really want. And I think if you put the two of them together, pay attention to what you really want. I moved into this work as opposed to that work because I was feeling inside that, well, back in my 20s, I had been a freelance writer, and I really particularly had as a goal for myself to write a book. And then finally it did come to fruition back when I was in my early 30s. And then I kind of got away from it, but it started to pull me back. I could feel it internally. I'd go into the Concord bookshop and I'd go, wow, books, books. And pay attention to those inner feelings, and piece by piece, step by step, let yourself go in that direction. You don't have to throw your job away and not pay any bills anymore or anything like that, but step by step, go in that direction. And that's what Henry did. He made it easier on himself because he didn't try to load himself up with a lot of material burdens, but still he did it. So that's how you take an insight from someone else. Allow yourself to follow their lead in whatever way you can.
Before we go, I wanted to inform listeners about where they can get a copy of your book, Walden For Hire: Business Lessons from Henry David Thoreau. Of course, you could visit your local bookstore, and if they don't happen to have it on the shelf, ask them to special order it, because many can get them in pretty quickly for you. You can always go to Amazon.com, and I know that's where you have said that you have all of your books listed. And then you do mention a place in Concord that you could go get a copy of the book. And could you tell listeners about that?
Right across the street from the Walden Pond entrance is a bookshop, and it's called the Thoreau Society. Thoreau Society is the premier grouping in the world, really, in terms of following Henry. And they have a great bookshop in there with not just my book, but they have, of course, editions of Walden and other things. And you don't have to drive in. You can even go to the Thoreau Society bookshop online and you could order it that way. But it's a great experience to go into that bookshop. So I would suggest it.
I think that sounds like a perfect day trip. Go to Concord, go to the Thoreau Society bookshop, and you can check out Henry's digs when he was living in the woods in Walden Woods and learn more about him. I think that's a perfect thing for people to do.
A lot of people may not know that there is a cabin, a replica of a cabin in the same grounds as this bookshop. Then you go across, and there's a trail all around Walden, and including a sign pointing to where the cabin originally was, call it the cabin site. So, it's a good day, good afternoon, 4 hours of sauntering around Thoreau environs. And yeah, I would recommend that.
I want to thank you, Ken Lizotte, for coming on to the podcast today to talk about your book, Walden For Hire, Business Lessons from Henry David Thoreau. I am going to put links in the show notes so that folks can go there and they can get a copy of the book. And I would strongly suggest, if you can, get out to Concord, Massachusetts. It's beautiful, and you can stop by the Thoreau Society bookshop, get the book, and learn more about Henry while you're there. Thank you again, Ken. It was a pleasure having you on the podcast today.
We'll have to get together, though, sometime, because we're so close.
Most definitely. Thank you so much again, Ken.
Yes, thank you.
Once again, I'd like to thank Ken Lizotte for coming on the podcast today to talk about his book, Walden For Hire, Business Lessons from Henry David Thoreau. As I mentioned, I have provided links in the show notes so you can buy the book and you can learn more about Ken via his consulting company's website. I hope you found the conversation as interesting and thought-provoking as I did. If you enjoyed the episode, share it with a friend or family member. It really helps when listeners can spread the word about the podcast and the fabulous guests we have on, as well as the topics we cover. I'll be back with a new episode of Notable New England on Sunday, March 1st, and I hope that you will tune in. Until then, take care, everybody.